Proteins are something that we've heard about because they're an important part of our diet. If we look at this nutrition label for macaroni and cheese, we can see that in addition to containing several grams of fat and carbohydrates, they also contain protein. Proteins are large biological molecules that are made of amino acids that are joined together by peptide bonds. To form proteins, many amino acids come together by dehydration to form peptide bonds, which is the bond between the carbonyl carbon of the carboxylic acid of one amino acid and the amino group nitrogen of another amino acid. Now, peptide bonds are incredibly strong. This helps proteins to do their jobs. An important role that proteins play in our bodies is that they provide structure. One example is the protein keratin. Keratin is a protein that is found in our hair and in the outer layer of our skin and in our nails. Keratin proteins come together and form filaments, which are long strands that are intertwined. If you think of a strand of rope that is made of many different smaller pieces of rope, it's made stronger by the fact that all of these different pieces are twined together, and that's exactly what happens in the case of keratin. Keratin is very hydrophobic and is insoluble in water. This hydrophobicity, or fear of water, is part of why keratin is so strong. The different strands of keratin protein are very attracted to one another, and less so to the outside environment, which helps them stay together. Another important structural protein is collagen. This is a main component of connective tissue, such as tendons and ligaments. And again, it's important for the structure that we find in our bodies. Another important role that proteins can play in biological systems is that they can act as enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that can make chemical reactions happen in our bodies. The way that they can make chemical reactions happen is that they decrease the activation barrier to making the reaction happen. So as an example of what I mean by an activation barrier, let's say your alarm goes off in the morning and you really don't want to get out of bed. It's really cold outside of your bed, which increases the activation barrier to you getting out of bed, or the amount of oomph it will take you to get out of bed. In the case of chemical reactions, we're talking about the amount of energy that it takes to make a certain reaction happen. So by decreasing the activation barrier, enzymes make reactions much more likely to occur. That would be similar to if somebody was making you coffee or somebody put a nice warm rug down on the floor for you to step onto. Maybe that would decrease your resistance to getting out of bed. Now, enzymes can make chemical reactions happen, and these are really important in many places in our body. One example you might have heard of that sort of is outside of our bodies is that of lactate. Lactate pills contain an enzyme that splits apart lactose sugar. And this is really important because some people cannot digest lactose and it causes them indigestion. Adding the enzyme breaks apart the lactose sugar and helps these people's stomachs to feel better. Another important role that proteins play in our bodies is that they allow for movement. Two of the most important proteins that help us move are actin and myosins. Actin is a protein that is highly involved in cell motility and cell mobility. It's also important for our muscles to contract so that we can move or walk. Myosins, I say myosins because there are many different versions of this protein, are a motor protein, and they're also really important for making our muscles contract. Proteins can also transport things throughout our bodies. An example of this is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen from our lungs to tissues throughout our body. And lipoproteins are proteins that can transport multiple fat molecules throughout our blood. Proteins are also able to act as messengers, taking messages from one part of our body to another. One example of this is insulin. Insulin is a protein that is able to lower our blood sugar. And when it's released from the pancreas by certain signals, it signals other cells to take glucose in and decrease our blood sugar. Similarly, human growth hormone is another protein that acts as a messenger. After it leaves the pituitary gland, it can travel around our bodies, bringing the message to grow or reproduce to our cells. Yet another important role that proteins can play is that they can protect us. Antibodies are large proteins that are able to recognize and attach to foreign substances within our bodies. So whether it's a cold virus that we've already had before and the antibody can recognize, or we're allergic to pollen and the antibody tries to attack that, antibodies are proteins that try to protect us. Finally, proteins are really important because they're able to regulate genes and other proteins. Sometimes they do this by cutting other proteins and activating them, or they can be proteins like transcription factors, which are able to bind certain pieces of DNA and decide whether they can be turned on or turned off. To summarize, proteins are large biological molecules that are made of amino acids and are joined together by peptide bonds. Peptide bonds are bonds between the carbonyl carbon of one amino acid and the amino nitrogen of another amino acid. Proteins are important because they can store energy, provide structure, act as enzymes to make reactions happen, can allow for movement, transport things, act as messengers, protect us from invaders, and regulate genes and other proteins.